To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And welcome to the series where I will review all 63 Disney animated films in chronological order. We, of course, are starting with what many consider to be the crown jewel of the Disney Company, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs follow Snow White, a princess who is forced to be a scullery maid because her stepmother, the evil queen, is jealous of her beauty. When a magic mirror declares Snow White to be the fairest one of all, the evil queen sends her huntsman to kill Snow White. Rather than killing Snow White, the huntsman warns her of the evil queen's plan, and Snow White runs into the forest where she finds a quaint little cabin inhabited by 7 dwarfs. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in December of 1937, may be one of the most important films in cinema history. As a lot of things did for Walt Disney, the idea of a full-length animated feature started as a dream that appeared to be an act of insanity to everyone else. People dubbed Snow White Walt's Folly, as they believed that no one would ever be interested in sitting through a full-length animated feature and that it would destroy the company. Fast forward to now, where Inside Out 2 is the highest-grossing movie of 2024. If Snow White was a failure, would we have the slew of animated films we have today? That's really impossible to say, but I think what we can all say is thank you to Snow White for making it possible to have the animated films we do have today. You might ask yourself, why did Walt choose to do Snow White as his first full-length movie? Well, it wasn't actually his first choice. Walt had other projects in mind and other projects suggested to him. His initial choice was Alice in Wonderland, but another studio was already working on a live-action version of Alice in Wonderland at that time, so Walt didn't choose it. Quick side note, I quickly want to mention public domain. A public domain is a term given to creative works that don't have any copyright on them, making it so anyone can make movies based off them. Alice in Wonderland, the Lewis Carroll book, is in the public domain, so that is why multiple studios could be working on an Alice in Wonderland project at the same time. Walt eventually did make Alice in Wonderland, releasing it in 1951. Other ideas that were suggested to Walt were the epic poems of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Walt bought the rights to adapt the Bambi book into a movie, but animation technology wasn't where he wanted it to be. But as we know, Bambi eventually became the fifth movie released by Disney in 1942. We actually have to go back to 1916 to get our first understanding as to why Walt had the idea of Snow White. It was shortly after his 15th birthday when the local newspaper in his town, the Kansas City Star, put on a special movie party. The movie that was shown was a silent film version of Snow White. The movie was shown simultaneously on 4 screens so that the thousands of people that were in the convention hall for this movie party could all see the film at the same time. Years later, when promoting Snow White, Walt told an interviewer that Snow White had the perfect story and it was a no-brainer to turn it into his first full-length feature. And the Disney studio had seen massive success with its short animated films, once starring Mickey Mouse and others simply called the Silly Symphonies. The Silly Symphonies featured new characters each short and were largely created to help train animators to synchronize music with movement. Popular ones you may have heard are Skeleton Dance and The 3 Little Pigs. The Silly Symphony shorts won 7 Oscars for Best Animated Short. Disney knew that making a full-length feature would be a hard sell on his team, so Walt treated them to a dinner and a show. He sent his team across the street to get dinner, and when they brought it back, Walt put on a 3-hour one-man show showing off his version for Snow White. One question that is frequently brought up when playing these get-to-know-you games, if you start a new job or at the beginning of a school year, is if you could travel back to a specific moment in time, what moment would you choose? My answer would be this moment, the 3-hour show of Snow White by Walt Disney. Disney initially took out a loan of $250,000 to make the movie. That quickly ran out, and then they took out another loan, and another loan, and another. Ultimately, the budget for the movie was roughly $1.5 million, which was astronomical for the time. Understandably, the main banker who was lending out this money wanted to see a cut of the film to see where all the money was going. The film wasn't finished when he watched it, it was not colored, and some scenes were not animated, only being storyboards. When Walt walked the banker back to his car, the banker told Walt, "This is going to make you a hatful of money." If Snow White failed, Disney would go out of business. I think we can all say we are very thankful Snow White was the success that it was. Snow White premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater on December 21st, 1937, later having a general release in the United States on February 4th, 1938. It was a massive success, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And saying that it was a massive success is a massive understatement. For its time, it became the highest grossing movie of all time. Walt always said that since kids' movie tickets were cheaper than adult tickets, the box office doesn't accurately show how many people actually saw Snow White, and that more people saw Snow White than any movie in American history. Think about a recent cultural phenomenon like Frozen. Everywhere you went, you either saw something related to Frozen or you heard Let It Go for the 100th time. I remember that when I went to Disneyland in the months and even years after Frozen, I saw more people dressed up as Frozen characters than I have ever seen when compared to other Disney movies. There were over 2,000 different types of Snow White merchandise products produced. The Snow White drinking glasses alone sold 16.5 million units. I think it would be fun to look at some reviews of Snow White from 1937. These are so fun to read. I only picked a couple, but if you liked hearing these, I recommend looking up more on your own time. Here are my thoughts. The Hollywood Reporter said, "Snow White meets even the wildest expectations of Disney's millions of admirers. It is a masterpiece of entertainment for people of every age and proves beyond a doubt that length is no handicap to sustained interest in this medium, provided the quality is of such a standard as this." Variety said, "The drawn figures of the story move through their adventures with realism that is heightened by visual poetry." Evening Star said, "Dopey, the most enchanting character to ever find his way to the screen. Disney may enter a safe claiming to immortality on the strength of creating Dopey alone. Snow White is a picture that is good for the soul. Seeing it should be an imperative, a legal one if necessary." There were a few negative reviews. The first one speaks to how groundbreaking the animation actually was. It's a negative review, but also shows how good the animation was. The St. Louis Dispatch said, "In the very excellence of its craftsmanship, Snow White reveals a deficiency. The little princess and wicked queen look so real that they cease to be good cartoons and become poor photographs." The Miami Herald said, "The other night we saw Snow White, which we know is nothing short of a miracle and perhaps the greatest motion picture ever made because the critics say so. And we were saddened beyond measure to discover that we failed to so recognize it. It shows you the state we are in." Now, the moment you've all been waiting for. What do I think of the movie? Nearly 88 years ago, Snow White was released, and today, it is still as timeless classic, and it's full of whimsical delight as ever before. It's hard to believe this was Walt Disney's first feature film. It shows mastery on every level, creating the blueprint for Disney's success. It's a fairy tale fantasy movie, but it somehow makes you feel that all that happens could be possible. I believe that I could run out into the woods and become friends with 7 dwarfs. Let's start off by talking about the animation of this movie. It's absolutely beautiful. It can sometimes be hard to appreciate older animation with the knowledge of what animation looks like today, but I would be absolutely perplexed if anyone watched Snow White and couldn't acknowledge its breathtaking beauty. Its colors are vibrant. Every background in this movie stands out as a beautiful piece of art. It's also very imaginative animation as well. One of my favorite sequences in this movie is when the huntsman tells Snow White the evil queen wants to kill her, and Snow White goes running into the forest. To show Snow's frenzied state, the logs in the pond turn into terrifying alligators. The branches of the trees shapeshift into hands that seemingly grab Snow, not wanting her to progress. It's just really imaginative animation that I enjoy watching so much. I feel like I could watch this movie with no sound and still have a great time with it. I also forgot how iconic the songs in this movie were till I watched the movie again recently. Whistle While You Work was a song that, for the longest time, I only knew from the old Disneyland sing-along videos. For the longest time, I never attributed that song to Snow White. The song isn't dated, it's still catchy, and it can get stuck in your head so easily. People still sing Hi-Ho when coming or going to work. My favorite song from the movie is probably the Dwarfs' Yodel. It's one of those songs where you probably couldn't whistle it off the top of your head, but you would instantly recognize it when you hear its melody. Maybe not from the movie, but it's the very first thing you hear on the Snow White ride at Disneyland. Despite all the success in the other areas, this movie wouldn't work without the characters working. It wouldn't have been as big of a critical and commercial success if we hated Snow White and despised the Seven Dwarfs. Good thing that they were absolutely delightful to spend time with. Snow White set the example of what a princess is, especially in regards to fairy tales. She's beautiful, kind, and likes to see the best of everyone. Is her character one-dimensional? Yes. Does her character go through an amazing character arc? No. But for the purpose of this movie, she doesn't need to. She's there to serve contrast to the evil queen. She's the catalyst of the whole movie, affecting everything that goes on around her. Her primary role of the movie was to be lovable and iconic, and she was all of that and more. The Seven Dwarfs, though, that's where this movie shines the absolute brightest. When we first meet the dwarfs in their mines singing away, we are introduced to them in about 2, maybe 2.5 minutes. And in those minutes, each dwarf is given their distinct personality that we grab onto and ride throughout the film. These dwarfs work so well together. They're absolutely lovely. They provide all the necessary things that make a film story feel complete. They're the sole source of comic relief, and it is done in a really creative and effective way. Each dwarf has a thing or a gag that is run throughout the entire movie. Typically, when one person only has one joke or gag they do throughout the movie, it becomes tiresome and annoying really quickly. However, with each dwarf having their own, it never feels tiresome because you have 7 going on throughout the entire movie. It helps the dwarfs feel like one character, and I think that helps you to not get overstimulated with them. They blend together as one in a really effective way. Fun fact, one of the main worries when it came to a full-length animated feature was how can you possibly come up with enough gags or jokes to fill the entire movie? So Walt actually had the whole studio, every employee, pitch a gag to put into the movie. You got paid if the gag was used, and depending on if it was just a shot or an entire scene. An example of a pitched gag is when the dwarfs first see Snow White sleeping in their beds, and they all rest their noses on the feetboard of the beds. It's so charming and whimsical. There isn't much to not love about the dwarfs. The story is incredibly well done. It flows extremely well, and it never, for a moment, feels dull. Overall, it's amazing how Snow White was able to knock it out of the park on the first try of Walt Disney. But at the same time, it was something Walt was passionate about, and those things usually turn out pretty well. When you watch this movie, you really do feel like a kid. There is this quote that Walt said that I think is a perfect reason as to why you feel this way. It was his philosophy for making animated features. We have never made pictures for children. That we do is a popular fallacy. We'd soon go broke if we did. What we really strive for in our productions is to appeal to the cold qualities which linger in every adult. After every movie, I am going to rank them in terms of my favorite. So by default, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs start at number 1, but it definitely deserves that spot. I wouldn't blame anyone if Snow White was at the top of their list, and we'll see how long Snow White is at the top of mine. Thank you for listening to this Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.